Welcome back to DMGI. Today we're going to tackle a very general topic, but one that comes up a lot with new DMs. How do I write lore? Which is a surprisingly complex question. In our modern video game era, lore is a timeline. It is history. If you look up lore of World of Warcraft, you will get a lot of videos chronicling the individual events that led to a certain character being a certain way or an event taking place. But lore is not history. It is not a timeline. At its most basic level, lore is the oral tradition of passing on knowledge, which is exactly what you're doing in Dungeons & Dragons. You are communicating information, telling facts, and hoping the players memorize those correctly. If they don't, the information becomes warped. It changes, much like the telephone game, or how drinking songs and rock and roll become children's rhymes. Lore is not a perfect history. It's just the parts that people remember, the parts that stuck around. And over time, humanity has invented tricks, like poetry and songs, that make it easier to remember the lore. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. What happened before that? What happened after? Nobody knows. But that's where the thrill comes from. We know that Jack and Jill went up that hill, and we know it was for water, but we don't know why they fell. Your job as Dungeon Master is to have that answer, and choose the right time to give players that information. Lore is not a 30-minute YouTube video making sure they say everything to avoid bad comments. Lore is the thesis statement for how your world became the way it is. You might have the syllabus, the timeline, the history, but your players receive just that rhyme. Just the Jack and Jill. In the background, however, you know that Jack is referring to King Louis XVI, who was beheaded, therefore lost his crown, and, tumbling after him, came Queen Marie Antoinette. And this took place during what's known as the Reign of Terror in 1793 France. So for our Jack and Jill verse, this world in its current state began when the king and queen were beheaded, and everything after that is a domino effect. And now with our thesis locked in, you can write the rest top to bottom. All additional facts, NPCs, locations support this idea that the king and queen were beheaded and led to our current world state. But you might be thinking to yourself, I'm not a writer DM. I've got other skills, but I don't really like writing or I don't think I'm good at it. Regardless of your DMing style, having a plan is really important, and that's all lore is. It is not an insurmountable book you need to write. It is at maximum, 2-sentence statement that is going to establish your style guide, so that everything that comes after that first session feels like the second session, feels like the third session, feels like the 100th session. But that's all well and good. Let's talk about how to actually write some lore. There are a number of rules I would like to caution you about. First and foremost, write for your audience. If you have a table of power gamers, goof-offs, HBO enthusiasts, write for your audience. Some gaming tables do not need detailed lore as long as there is a monster supplied each week. This is where you would also account for your players' maturity and sensibilities. A part of this first rule, but definitely the second rule, is avoid self-serving lore. Lore that only you would be interested in. It's a very common practice when starting a new campaign to just ask the table, ask your group of friends what they're into, what would they like to see, what their favorite books and movies are. Don't make them a world that only you are going to enjoy. This is about cooperative storytelling. They're going to be a part of it. There needs to be room for them to have an impact, to have an effect, or to ruin your idea, to mess with your lore. The world needs a certain malleability. It can't be so concrete that you would be offended or upset if they were to mess around in your world a little bit. And along that vein, your campaign isn't an opportunity for you to explore your own psyche. Let's say you had a bad breakup, and you want to use that emotion to make a evil queen. That's not a healthy practice. That's going to drudge up a lot of emotions, fill your world with baggage, and again make you unable to react to the things your players are doing. Which leads right into rule number 3. You have to know the ending. You have to be able to answer those essential questions that your lore poses. We want a satisfying story, not a mystery box. If you'd like to hear more about the mystery box, look up The Mailbag from Season 6, Episode 5. And the 4th rule, and one we've already been talking about, is it needs to be easy to remember and resilient to player mistakes. You should be able to communicate the lore of your world succinctly while maintaining eye contact with your players without the help of notes. So let's do some simple examples. An evil empire wants to take over the world. Excellent. Why? Resources. Power. Could be a number of things. But it's very easy to understand why an empire would want to expand. Another example, one I hear a lot actually. The gods are dead. What does that mean? Are there new people pursuing power to become gods? Are the thrones of the gods open? The vacuum of power is leading people to quest for divinity? Now we're starting to get close to something actionable. Another example. 5 cities, 5 factions are at war. Over what? It would be more valuable to focus on what those 5 factions are after as our thesis statement, and then design our 5 factions to support that idea. Once you find that statement, you can start writing, which isn't an easy thing for everybody, so let's break that down as well. Writing, like anything in life but particularly art, takes practice and time. Time that you might not necessarily have to give your hobby. So there's nothing wrong with tracing, with copying. And that's why your next step is to create a style guide for yourself. Think about your favorite authors, your favorite books, the way people speak in your favorite movies. There is a consistency that makes that world function. We know we're in the world of Harry Potter because people have these vaguely magical British names. Severus Snape, Albus Dumbledore. If we put a character in called Fern Twinkle or Winfeld Snakebark, we would capture that Harry Potter feel. This is a game played with words after all, and your word choices are very important for setting that tone. If you wanted to make a Lovecraftian world, you would say things like accursed, antiquarian, eldritch, indescribable, non-Euclidean, tenebrous. You wouldn't call the Underdark smelly, you would call it dank. If you wanted to create a creation myth for your world, you might copy the cadence and style of scripture. How does your world organize its history? Does it use dates? Eras? If you wanted to give your world a Tolkien feel, you might use ages, the time of the first sun. Certainly that's what Forgotten Realms did. Might be a little cheesy to put it this way, but you're making a palette. You're choosing all your various colors you're going to be painting with. Copy, paste, make a document for yourself so whenever you write something for your world, it is standardized and a part of that universe. And if you're still having trouble writing, don't be afraid to just steal a whole paragraph, delete some words, and insert your own. Just trace over the top of someone else's work. No one's gonna run you through a plagiarism check. You're not gonna get called out. This is a for fun game at home for you to enjoy with your friends. Don't stress and hold yourself to ridiculous standards. And now with your thesis on top, supported by your ideas and facts for your world, it's time to start making some choices. In particular, it's time to decide where your lore is going to happen in your game. What beat in the story structure is going to provide the players with the answers to their questions about the lore. And in the negative, these are often called lore dumps, where the DM sits the players down and explains for an extended period of time why things are the way they are. We want to avoid that. That's why we have our simple lore thesis and our style guide to make sure any other facts that support the lore are digestible by the players and match up with any other information we've given them. A bad example of a lore dump is what happened at the end of Matrix Reloaded, where the architect explained the purpose of the Matrix to Neo. The endless cycle. A good example of a lore dump is what happened at the end of Watchmen. Ozymandias explains everything to Rorschach. Or what happened at the end of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, where the spirit of Dumbledore explained to Harry how the magic between him and Voldemort worked. The main difference between this good lore dump and this bad lore dump is that we already had all the information, we just needed a character, or in our case, the DM, to put it all together, to line up the facts so it all fell into place. We didn't know who the architect in Matrix 2 was. That wasn't a satisfying reveal. His presence was a deus ex machina, or even it just posed more questions. That's not satisfying at all. There was a third Matrix movie, but that didn't really help. All three of these examples have their big lore reveals at the end. Everything leading to that point is the breadcrumb trail, with the hope that our audience, the players, will put it together for themselves by the end. If not, or even just to confirm their suspicions and their thoughts, we have that final talk with our NPC. But your world doesn't have to be full of mystery. You can provide answers to the players anywhere you want. Using a 3-act structure, which is a very simple way to write a story, we have the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. If you provide all your lore in the setup, you can have a story like John Wick or The Mandalorian. The quest is what's important. Information we get as we go helps, but it doesn't change the ultimate quest. These stories often lead with a voiceover or a scrolling pile of text. If your world is going to dive right in, be lore heavy from the start, it's best if you let the players know the lore of your world during their character creation, so they can match this lore heavy world they're entering. Lore can also be delivered in the middle, like in The Mummy or Mass Effect. Commander Shepard has a lot of questions, and then has a conversation with Sovereign, which propels them to the end. This would take place at the end of Act 2, in a 3-act structure. Act 2 is also traditionally where the big twist in the story happens, but we'll talk about writing twists in a different episode. And you might just dispense lore throughout the whole thing, and this is for players who are interested in lore. Many video games do this. The one that comes to mind for me is Diablo 2. You're a hero who's going to kill a demon. You don't need to know more than that, if you don't want to. But if you choose to talk around, if you choose to listen to all those conversations, well, you can be subject to additional lore. Now, this isn't optional in movies, but Clarice, in Silence of the Lambs, wants more information, and lore is piecemealed to her in 3 different instances by Hannibal Lecter. Based on where you choose to put these big lore moments, it can impact how you tell your story. But the basics remain the same. And if all this writing talk has made you nervous, if you feel like you have to bare your soul through performance, through acting, preparing great characters or speeches, there are ways to circumvent that. You can give your players handouts, diary entries, tell them of visions they're having. Use dreams to communicate the feeling of these exchanges, rather than having that one-on-one talk with Dumbledore. This doesn't have to be a performance piece, a dissertation. In fact, it's way better to support your lore with simple things. What's in people's pockets? What flags, symbols, crests of allegiance do they have? If your world has gods, what holy symbols do people wear? What tradesmen wear certain holy symbols? What are the blacksmith insignias? When your players find their 100th longsword, does it have an engraving on it? Is it made by the same blacksmith that made the item they're looking for? That sort of small stuff is way more powerful than a big conversation, than a big lore dump later on. Despite all this talk and advice about planning, there is still one absolute truth in D&D when it comes to lore. The most important lore is the one the players write down. If they think it's important, it is important. Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find more episodes like this over at kyleferguson.com or wherever podcasts can be found. Music was by Brian Griffith, and I will see you next week with a new topic for DM Gives Inspiration.